everyone, and welcome back again to the Winning Mindset Academy podcast. And it's been a while, and I hope you've all been in good spirits and been safe and well during COVID. And of course, in some states in Australia now, we're out of COVID. But Victoria, we're still very resilient in this part of the world. So again, I have today a very, very remarkable and interesting gentleman by the name of Peter Mousaferiadis. And Peter, I met Peter a few years ago when I was on the board with Brilliant Women Global, and Peter and his company are one of the major sponsors for the day. And as you know, Brilliant Women Global stands for diversity and inclusiveness. And Peter's whole philosophy and company was built around that with a program called Diversity Atlas and backed by a company. And Peter is the CEO of Cultural Infusion. And by the way, that company is making headway globally. I'm lucky to actually be interviewing Peter today. This is the third time that we've actually been able to connect because he's such a busy man. The world wants to talk to him. So very, very honored to be a partner with Cultural Infusion. And of course, really interesting. A little bit about Peter. I won't give away too much. It's interesting, gentlemen. What you see is not really what is behind the gentleman. He's an entrepreneur, of course, a philanthropist, a conductor of music. So we'll discuss about that later. And one of the things that really drew me to what Peter's philosophy is all about is that all through life, since he was a kid, he always asked the question, why? Why do things turn out this way rather than accepting the facts? Yes, but what is behind all of this, which has probably led throughout his life into what he's doing and to what he's talking about today. So without any further ado, I want you to welcome and a big round of applause if you're watching right now, Peter Mousaferiadis. Welcome.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction, Philip. I really appreciate it. And I just want you to know that I've always got time for you. Thank you, Philip.
Peter, thank you so much, Peter. Thank you. Well, Peter, as I said to my audience, you know, you're a colorful character and a very surprising person. For the things that you've told me through my life, I'm just in awe. But let's start at the beginning because there's many layers to Peter Mousaferiadis. And just want to find out a bit about your background. Were you born here? How did you come to Australia? How did it all begin for you?
Well, my parents came to Australia in the 50s. My father came in 1954. My mother came in 1956. They came here for a better life. I think of my father's life. He was born in the 20s. During a time of great poverty. His parents were exiled from the Ottoman Empire, Turkey today. They had to restart their whole life from the beginning. They lost absolutely everything. They were sent on death marches. You know, they lost siblings on these death marches. In the 30s came along, more poverty. The end of the 30s, World War II. After World War II, a civil war broke out and atrocious things happened where Greeks slaughtered each other, brothers and sisters were at each other. And then, you know, my father came here in the 50s for a better life. I was born in the late 60s, in 68. You know, my parents were working class, you know, migrants. They worked in factories. Then they had a milk bar in the western suburbs of Newport. I grew up behind that milk bar. I think we went into that milk bar in the early 1970s in an area which was predominantly Anglo-Saxon Celtic area. So we were victims of ongoing ethnic and race-based discrimination. And this discrimination continues in all forms and still continues until today. So I suppose in many ways that was my foray, my introduction to the work that I'm doing today. And during this journey, you know, before I started to work in this professional capacity as a conductor, composer, and I've had many different careers, I met a lot of wonderful people along the way, people who were giving, people who taught me the power of giving. And I think that has really remained with me today.
Fantastic, Peter. That is certainly, you know, a very strong background and upbringing. And I can understand why now your cause is all about diversity and inclusiveness.
Initially West Footscray. I was born in West Footscray and then moved at the age of 4 to Newport, spent the next 20 years there. I then went overseas and worked or studied studied conducting. I studied in Czechoslovakia before it split up, in Italy. Did a stint in the US for about 6 months. So all up about 4 years I spent overseas studying, and then I came back and brought those skills and I suppose the critical thinking that I developed to allow me to do what I'm doing today. Okay,
great. So you wanted to make a life as a musician initially, is that correct?
Yeah, so not quite actually. I was tossing up between whether I wanted to become a theologian. So I studied Koine Greek, which was the Greek of the New Testament, and the Greek that came about as a result of that great period of confluence when the Greeks arrived in South Asia, South and Central Asia, 2,300 years ago, and the language underwent a massive sort of transformation, and sort of in many ways that period created the pathway, I suppose, for Christianity to flourish and new thinking to emerge. So I was really interested in the writings of the early Christian writings, but the arts got the better of me, music got the better of me. So I was always studying music, and I ended up going to the Victorian College of the Arts. I studied music there. I graduated with a Bachelor of Arts from La Trobe University, majoring in religious studies.
Right.
But then the arts got the better of me. I became a conductor, and before I knew it, I segued into becoming a creative director. I produced 9 Australia Day concerts for our state government here in Victoria. Produced a lot of shows in East and Southeast Asia. Lots of opening and closing ceremonies for clients such as the Parliament of World Religions, the United Nations, and a whole range of other clients. And all along, there was always this common theme of me working with people from many different cultures. And I suppose that's what led to me developing Cultural Infusion and also our mapping tool, Diversity Atlas, because I was asking that question, why? What are the differences? How do we analyze these differences? And that, I suppose, gave way to this, scientific approach to what we've done today, and has allowed us to create this data analytics tool, which is now starting to transform communities and a whole range of other spaces and organizations across the globe.
Wow. Okay, I'm going to take a breath there for a minute and step back a few things. Just a couple of, before we get into Diversity Atlas. I'm just thinking, I'm trying to put myself in your shoes as far as where you were heading between the arts and then you got into music and theology, which I didn't know about, but that is amazing. And so obviously you have a very spiritual side to you as well, which you bring to the table, which is amazing. But you know what, I work with a lot of people and businesses, and people like to plan ahead their life, and I'm setting my career. I want to set goals in life. This is where I want to go to. How did that play out in your life during that time, theology and then music, being a conductor? I could see a lot of passion there. Passion is critical to success. I mean, if you're not passionate about something, it probably won't happen. I know that for a fact, and I can see that in you. But how did that all play out? Was it a surprise all of a sudden when I'm saying, oh, this is happening? It wasn't, I'm not going to go out and just do this. It just happened because of your passion.
I think of this all the time, and I think, why is it I've gone on to do what I've done and others haven't? What is it? What's this incessant desire in me that wants me to always make things better? Constantly improve myself, look for answers, and I think it's a combination of many things. I don't think you can pinpoint one particular reason. I wish I could, but I think it's a combination of my environment where I grew up. It's the values that my parents instilled in me. I think it's this incessant desire to want to make a difference. So that requires passion. It requires also the capacity to work endless amounts of hours. Like sometimes I will start work at 4 a.m. and I will finish the following day at 5 a.m. and maybe have an hour and a half, 2 hours off. I just go. I don't have a problem with that. People say you're crazy, and I say, well, look, that's just me. I like doing it because I'm looking for solutions. I'm looking for ways to be able to serve humanity, and I want to place humanity before myself. And I suppose that's what I've always done. But at the same time, recognizing that you need to have an economic paradigm that underpins all of that. So I've always thought about numbers. I've always been pretty good at numbers. I was sent to maths camps as a kid, so I was able to really calculate things really fast. And whenever I would hear an idea, I would begin to start to calculate in my head, is that idea practical? And I still do that to this day. And when I walk, I just count. I don't know why. I've always done that since I've been a little kid. And I suppose as a conductor, I developed a skill set to be able to read 20 lines at once and hear music in my head, and then be able to, conduct orchestras and conduct people who had 40 years more experience than me. So how do you bring all these different skill sets together? How do you lead it to create an outcome that is going to achieve what you want? But in terms of my work, it was always about this common thread where I wanted to build intercultural understanding as this core value and key competency of what it means to be a global citizen. So, yeah, I've always been about building harmony through intercultural action and trying to take a measurement approach to that. So, and that idea really only came about 7 years ago, because beforehand I was working aimlessly in trying to make the world a better place. And now it's been about, no, there's a science to this. And this idea of developing a science, a scientific approach to trying to improve things and improve life and improve societies and improve cultures is not a new idea. And this is what I came to realize. And I often say to people that if you want to find solutions to challenges, look in the past. So I'm an avid reader. I'm constantly reading history. I'm constantly reading why civilizations had these great periods and why were they wiped off the face of the earth? What was it that caused great moments in period to disappear? We need to understand that better. So when our governments start to not invest in humanities, that's, for me, is really concerning. And I'm seeing some really worrying signs across the globe at the moment, especially in English-speaking nations, which are using sort of globalization, which isn't just about economics, but also about science, about culture, about trying to almost dominate through this one mindset, which starts to have impact across the globe. And during that process can also create destruction. So you just need to look at the last 13, 14 years. And I'm sorry, I'm just rambling on here. We're just having this conversation. But if you look at the last, 14 years since the rise of social media, that has also coincided with the decline in peace across the globe. So we all need to be coming together to understand why.
Yeah, it's so complex. You're on the money. That when you said social media, is quite interesting how Facebook is now being really held accountable for, and I'm not talking out of context here. It's out in the news, and there was an outbreak, an outage, and that went down. And of course, the responsibility of big platforms like that in coming across with bullying, with discrimination online, and then not getting away with it. It's being faceless, and there's a big problem.
And I think we need to understand why. It's because social media is connected to big data.
Yeah,
big data is the new oil today. That's how it's being described. So when you have big data, that also can lead to transactional activity. That's why it's it's the new oil. So that allows. So what social media platforms do is they feed that biological mechanism that was built into us over hundreds of thousands of years. It's called fear.
Yeah.
When humanity was in its early stages, it was concerned about a lion or some enemy coming from around the corner to eat them or attack them. So we've had this fear mechanism that's in us. And what social media does, a lot of social media platforms, is they feed that with all sorts of information, and most of it's misinformation. And of course, when there's misinformation, people gravitate towards social media platforms. And before you know it, there's all sorts of data that's being circulated as a result of that to big corporations, which then are allowed to drive transactional activity to that. So this is really concerning. So we need to create some disruption, and I don't know how that's going to happen yet. I don't think anyone's worked out the solution.
Yes, I mean, we'll come to cultural infusion in a minute. I mean, that's a start in what you're doing, and it's quite, I want to sort of delve into that a little bit more. But just staying on that subject now, I mean, the pandemic in itself as a, and as we know, pandemics have been around for centuries and for thousands of years. This is not new. It's got a different face. It's called coronavirus, and we're dealing with it in the modern arena. We're more knowledgeable. We've got more vaccines. There's more research, more scientists understand that. So it's not uncommon with what's going on. But the thing about it, it is interesting because I study human behavior as an NLP master practitioner, HR and part psychologist, etc. in what I do with my leadership. And I'm, looking at the behavior of humans and how they interact with what the media is saying, as you're saying earlier. For example, the riots that we recently had and how humans, certain level of humans behave. And in the value, all humans, we go through 7 values from value 1 right to the value 7. Now, this is something that obviously that I've got through neuro-linguistic programming. And value 1 is, of course, is the very base level of, it's all about me. It's food, hunger, the basics in life. And I'm not worried about anyone else. It's the survival of the fittest. And we go right through to the top level of 7 of 8 values, where you're talking the spiritual values, etc. But it's amazing how people operate at different levels. You're obviously observing this because it crosses discrimination. It crosses a whole lot of different things, or it's easy to pull out that discrimination from card when dealt with, etc. What is your take on all of this?
Well, if you want to understand discrimination, I think we need to understand what are the drivers of discrimination. Just like anything, it's about understanding what's the source. Let's keep on asking the question, why? So we know that what drives discrimination is fear and ignorance. So the counter drivers then become education, become collaboration, become familiarization. It's as simple as that. And then it's about being able to unpack that. But you've touched on this a spiritual dimension, and I define myself as someone as being really spiritual. Yeah, I do. I do, and I sit on the Global Council of United Religions Initiative. So I've been always part of interfaith collectives across the world and interfaith discussions, and I enjoy that because that helps me to understand the other, and it helps me to try to see the other through their shoes. It's about how do I put the encounter with the other, not from a value-centric, not from an ethnocentric perspective, not from my social norm-centric perspective, but from a completely different, perspective. So it's trying to understand the other person and then trying to meet them midway. I'll just share an anecdote with you. There's this little chicken, walking down this highway, and as it's walking along, straddling from side to side, it's sort of something catches its eyesight, and it looks to the other side, and it sees this other chicken, and it screams out to the other chicken, "How do I get to the other side? How do I get to the other side?" And the other chicken responds, "You are on the other side." So the point I'm trying to make is that, we're forever othering all our encounters, and governments do this. Yeah. More than ever, they choose language which is about segregating one group of people into one basket, and then you have another group here, and so we need to start to think of how language can become more inclusive. There's many things that play a role. So come back to your question. I think this all led to my work with Cultural Infusion, which we established in 2002, and the idea was, how can we initially go out and motivate behavioral change by using market forces. So, people call that social entrepreneurialism. I call it cultural entrepreneurialism because I'm focusing on culture, which is what really defines us, and behaviors and ways and social norms. So if you really want to change a society, you need to change the culture first. So you need to have cultural impact before you can impact on culture before you can have impact on society. So for us, it was about taking programs into schools initially, and then from programs we started to move into a whole range of other experience programs. I was already, producing events, and that was continuing during the time of Cultural Infusion. And then around 6.5, 7 years ago, we segued to Diversity Atlas.
Fantastic. Yes, it was. I do remember we had a conversation on this before today, and I mentioned there was a program that just finished on TV about racism, where they piloted a primary school in Melbourne. I don't know whether you had a chance to see that on ABC, and it's to do with racism, and they had all the different cultures of young kids around 10, 7, 8, 9, 10. And they came from all backgrounds, and the teachers were also of all backgrounds. And it's a great study of really asking these kids about, what did they understand racism? Did they understand the color of their skin? Why do they look different? And et cetera, et cetera. It was an eye opener, and it was a successful program, and hopefully being piloted right throughout Australia very soon. But that's where it starts. You talk about culture and background. That's where it starts at root cause. And of course, it transpires through the generations. Did you have a chance to see that? Because
no, I didn't. But I think you sent me a link to it, and but I'm aware of the program. We need to start with the young ones, but it needs to be ongoing. And the reason why it needs to be ongoing is because culture is not static, and our environments are constantly changing. So when we talk about culture, we need to try to define what type of culture we're talking about. Are we talking about organizational culture? Are we talking about a national culture? Are we talking about someone's ethno-linguistic background? What is it that we're talking about? Is it a culture of peace? Is it a culture of sustainability? There's so many different types of cultures. But when we talk about cultural diversity, and that's where we see a lot of racism taking place, ethnic and race-based discrimination, because they're both very different. We tend to sort of conflate racism with ethnicity. They certainly do that in the US and in the UK, but they're very two different categories, two different types of discrimination. So for us, it's about, once again, understanding that fear is what drives. Fear and ignorance is what drives racism. So creating programs where you're going to discover the other becomes extremely important. But it's also about recognizing that our environments that we operate in, our societies that we operate in, often have a cultural hegemony. And that cultural hegemony usually affords privileges to those who are connected to it. So what do I mean by that? So let's look at education, for example. Well, you're going to school, to an English school, and it would be probably English thought that it's influenced that language, which of course it naturally has. And then maybe there are a lot of the programs that are connected to that are probably connected to, let's take the arts, for example. They'd be connected to 18th, 19th century, Western classical European and mainstream traditions. Well, hang on, you've opened your doors now to people that come from the Horn of Africa, or to people that come from Uganda, or from South America, or the Hmong people from, from Vietnam, or from around the Mekong River. Hang on, I mean, this is a completely different way of thinking to them. They're not exposed to that. So you impose this education system, so they're immediately not going to probably do as well at that as someone who's already been exposed to it and comes from a similar background. So it's about being able to understand what is actually going on at all levels. And I think that when we look at society and we look at anything, everything has a diversity touch point. Why? Because diversity in essence just means difference. That's all it means. Diverse, difference. No one thing can be diverse. You need two or more things to be, because diversity is an aggregate of a group or two or more different things. So then it's about understanding, well, what are these metrics that make up diversity? Well, that's not difficult to do. Mathematics is pretty advanced, and we know one metric is variety. You can apply an algorithm to that. So what do we mean by that? Variety means the absence of monotony. So let's say in one group that you've got 4 people that speak Spanish, for example, and another group you've got a Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and French-speaking person. Well, there's greater variety of people there, of languages spoken. That's one metric. Another metric is balance. which is looking at the distribution of what we're trying to measure across something. There was a human rights report that came out a couple of years ago, which showed that the further north you go in an organization, the more monocultural they become. Or you might find in the accounts area, most of the people are from the finance, or the cleaners from the Horn of Africa. This is another metric. And the final metric, and the most important metric, is really dissimilarity or distance, which is the distance of what we're trying to measure, the dissimilarity between the units we're trying to measure. So that second group that I talked about, that French, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese languages, think of now another group with Arabic, Japanese, Swahili, and Portuguese. That's going to be more diverse. Why? Because someone's ethno-linguistic background shapes cognitive processes, shapes values, influences your smile. And we mustn't forget that. So this is how we need to begin to understand diversity in its full sense. And we don't do that. And that's the work that we've been doing over the last 7 years, is to provide this scientific methodology to it. So when organizations want to develop an inclusion strategy, a strategy around equity, they can take a data-driven approach to do that.
Absolutely. I mean, what you're saying is so interesting. It brings to mind the various cultures of various worlds and countries of, certain countries like Russia, for example. I'm not saying anything out of terms, but for one person to smile over there is not right because you're getting too familiar. So their culture is you don't smile. And that happens in Russia, but it doesn't mean that they're rude. The fact that I don't know you, so I can't smile at you, and whereas in our part of the world, it's quite different.
Well, it's so interesting you talk about this, because it only occurred to me recently. My father, until recently, my mother's a giggler. She just smiles and smiles and smiles. Yeah. My father, I think she's just been really flippant and silly. Yeah. And if we smiled too much, my father would say, "What the hell are you doing?" Now, he came from the depths of the Ottoman Empire, and they're really serious people there. And someone said to me, "Oh, where your father comes from, they're all really serious." And when I reflected, I thought, yeah, he's right. They're almost sort of bordering on, I'm not going to say pessimism, but there's this solemnness about it. There's this sort of stoicness. It's the complete opposite. And these are two people who identify as being of Greek heritage, but very different parts of the Hellenic world. Because Greeks, once upon a time lived all the way up until in India, Pakistan, Central Asia. They lived throughout the whole world. And then nationalism came along and people were pushed out from one country to the next. But you even get variations within one culture. Yeah. So it's an excellent point. You're right. Russians, how often do you look at photos of Russians? They don't smile at them. And I've spent a lot of time with Russians. If you smile there, they think you're stupid. They think there's something wrong with you.
We all know when they had was it the Olympics there, or was it the recent Olympics that they were told, was it in Russia? They had one of the games there. And of course, they were told that they were trained all how to smile to the world. They said, you now have to learn to smile, because it's not part of their culture. It's quite interesting. And we have to respect that. That's the other thing. Whatever it is, we need to respect each other's culture, because what we see is not necessarily what the message is. And that's the world I work in neuro-linguistic programming. It's language and observation of your physiology is so critical, and misunderstanding occurs out of that, in all sorts of, in all shapes and forms.
That's right. And if you think of, the global population, I think it's less than 15% of it really identify as individualistic. Yes. The other 85% are collectivist. Yet it's that 15% that really dominates the world. And one of the reasons for that is when the United Nations was established, they spent the better part of 2.5, 3 decades establishing their strategies. And those strategies were developed by people from a Northern European and Anglo-centric background and American-centric background. And the idea was to really advance those people who were individualistic, but also to advance neoliberalism. So that's what really drove this massive economic globalization in many ways. And now we're seeing the rise of the global South, who are saying, "Well, hang on, we see the world a little bit differently to the way Americans see it or the English might see it, and we need to now begin to create spaces to allow for different ways of doing things." And that starts to really impact policies and legislation. So the world's going through a really interesting time at the moment, and we're probably moving from this sort of unipolar world to this multipolar world, where the US will no longer be the one that the beacon that everyone looks to, but we'll see the emergence of all these different civilization states, as Martin Jacques refers to them. So the emergence of China, the emergence of Russia, the emergence of Turkey, India, Brazil, who will start to exert influence, across the globe.
Fantastic. Okay, well, that brings me to obviously cultural infusion and why you've been so busy over the last few months, and the world wants to talk to you about this amazing innovation of yours. So tell us a little bit about what cultural infusion is all about.
Yeah, cultural infusion, I suppose, its aim is to build global harmony through intercultural action. That's the big vision. That's what we want to do, yeah? And the way we do that is through education, through our experience programs, through a whole range of digital platforms that we've created. But I think our flagship program, which we spent the better part of 6 years of R&D, is Diversity Atlas, which contains the largest data sets in the world, inclusive data sets in the world. So we have more than 12,500 languages and speech communities, 8,500 religions, 8,500 ethnicities, national cultures, geo cultures, subcultures, in that, to ensure that no one is left out. Because at the moment, actually, let me go back one step. We're just having a conversation here because my mind's going all over the place.
That's fine.
I might preface Diversity Atlas by saying that let's go back to 1989. And 1989 was a pretty significant year. Why? Two main things happened in 1989. The Berlin Wall collapsed, and the whole world thought that would be the end of wars all over the world. No more erecting barriers. Couldn't be further from the truth. Who's that geopolitical theorist? He's a Japanese American. I've forgotten his name. He wrote a book about that. But then there's the second monumental thing that happened then was Tim Berners-Lee inventing the World Wide Web. These two major things, and especially the latter, have really transformed the world. Why? Because they've created this super diverse, hyper diverse world where time and space have become compressed. We can have this conversation we couldn't have a few years ago. You can send a bit of information anywhere you want in the world. You can access information all over the world. So this has also led to a period of massive economic globalization, phenomenal economic globalization, but without globalization of values and ethics. So if we want to really develop a globalization or understanding of values and ethics and start to, how can we all subscribe to a series of values across the globe, then we need understanding, and we need to have understanding of the other. And that's why data is really important, and data around humanity is really important. So we've developed the largest database in the whole world around languages, cultures, and religions. We also have countries in there too. It's the most inclusive, and we're constantly refining it and developing it. And why is that important? Well, when you go out there to collect data across the world, you quickly find that people have different understandings of culture, or certain questions you can ask in one part of the world that you can't ask in another part of the world.
Exactly. Yeah.
So if you think of even in Diversity Atlas, if you think we look at gender, but we look at not only we look at different aspects of gender. We look at this LGBTQIA+, which is really a conflation of a whole range of different categories. It's gender identity. It's how you identify. You identify as a male, female, or something else. Gender expression. How do you express yourself? So I might express myself. I might express myself as a man, but I might feel like a woman inside. Identify as a woman inside. because the gender is a social construct. You know, my mother's father, you know, wore a dress by today's standards. That was like a national costume.
Right.
If you wore a dress out in the streets, people would think he was a cross-dresser. Then you have sexual orientation, and you have biological sex. So it's really being able to understand this. And this is what we try to do with diversity. It's not just looking at ethno-linguistic religious background of an individual, but looking at a whole range of other different dimensions of diversity, which then allow us to go, okay, how can we now start to create and develop strategies for our workers, for people to feel safe, that they can bring their full self to any setting.
That is amazing, because there is nothing like that out there in the market for what you're doing. And so on about Diversity Atlas, and you know, the proofs in itself, you are working with some huge names out there. I know we can't mention some of them, but some global movers and shakers. And for you to be in that space, but the thing about keeping it very simple, Diversity Atlas asks the questions that other data, you know, research cannot ask, and you're cutting through all of that. And that's mind blowing, you know, through religion, through ethnic backgrounds, through culture. I mean, they are deep areas.
Yeah, well, Philip, why do we do this? Because, well, we know there's a myriad of studies out there by McKinsey, by Deloitte, PwC, KPMG, and the list just goes on. There's so many studies out there that, you know, if the more cultural, in particular cultural diversity that you have, you're going to be 6 times more innovative, 6 times more likely to exceed your targets. Generally, you're at least 35% more profitable than others who are least diverse out there. And that's just looking at cultural diversity. But you can improve your staff retention if you understand who your workforce is. You can attract better staff. You can better market yourself. You can start to look at representation of how representative you are of your community you're delivering services to. And we know there's a strong correlation between performance, efficiency, profitability with those organizations that reflect the communities that they're operating in. I mean, this is a no-brainer, you know, but what we do is we take that deep dive. Everyone's developing inclusion strategies and diversity strategies and equity strategies, but how are they doing it? We've got the data and the deep dive data that's going to allow them to go, yep, we can see now who we are, and this is who we are now. How can we put in strategies now so we can be more diverse in 3 years' time? How can we maybe work towards, over the next 10 years, have a workforce that is at least, that reflects the percentage of people in the community that identify as being First Nations? Yeah. So in Australia, about 3% of the population that defines as being First Nations. How can we, over the next 10-year period, go, you know what, we're sitting at now 0.2%. How can we work towards making that 3%? So that may be, if you're a large corporation, developing a whole range of different programs, pathways for people to come into your organization. So what does that actually create? Well, that creates more equitable environments. If you do something good for business, it's going to flow out into the community. And I know we're sort of running out of time here, but I'm going to just put a few numbers out there to the listeners. Something like 13.5% to 14% of the global GDP is spent on dealing with the cost of violence. So we're talking about $14 trillion every year. 75% of that, according to the UN, has a dimension of culture. So 75% of all the conflict that we experience in the world today, whether it be micro or macro level, has a cultural dimension. So why aren't we investing more in understanding culture and reducing the impact on the global GDP? If we could reduce the global GDP by $1 trillion every year that's spent on trying to deal with conflict across the place, imagine what we could do with that money to make the world a better place. That's only $1 trillion. I reckon we can get it down to $2 or $3 trillion in the next 10 years if we work.
Fantastic. Man, what a way to actually finish with those numbers. I think that you've summed it up beautifully. And yes, the need for it over the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, that's where we need to invest, and if we're going to affect culture. Peter, can I ask you one little gem that you can leave my audience with before we sign out, as to in understanding that my audience it comes from all backgrounds, all positions. It's interesting, something that they can take away from today.
Look, there may be two things I can share with your audience, right, Philip, and that is when I went to school, everyone was trying to work out how long the universe had been around. I think it was in 2006, was it Mather and Kramer, or Schmoot and Kramer had worked out, two physicists who worked out when the Big Bang occurred, which was 13.7 billion years ago. That was revised to 13.9 billion years. And Stephen Hawkins, when he was alive, said this is the greatest scientific discovery of all time, because there's something like 1,500 physicists and scientists all over the world were trying to work out this number. Now, there may be many universes out there, but our universe, according to physicists, we've been here for 13.9 billion years. To think that that universe is coming to being and come into existence for you and I to have this conversation is worth celebrating. What are the chances of that? So that's something spiritually that I want to leave with all the listeners out there. And the last thing that I want to leave the listeners with is that I think my strength and what's allowed me to grow is admitting that I'm vulnerable, that I don't know. And the more I know, the more I'm drawn to nothingness. And when I say I don't know, I'm starting from this base position where people can support me. And I think that's the best thing that we can all do. Not feign that we know something when we do not. I don't know. How can you know everything?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Peter. That's such wise words to end up. And it's sort of one of the philosophies I always say, the more you know, the more you find out how little you know in life. And that's, the humility and the vulnerability behind that. Peter Mousaferiadis, thank you so much for your time today. It's been awesome. It's been inspiring. It's been enlightening for me and my audience. I can't wait to share this. Until next time, ladies and gentlemen, signing out, Philip Fernandez, Winning Mindset Academy. Have a great day. Thank you.